All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Today's webinar, Centering Justice and Equity in Sustainability. This is part of our bi-weekly 2021 Art of Resilience speaker series. This series is a joint effort between the College of St. Scholastica and the University of Minnesota Duluth Sustainability Office to bring together campuses to explore the...
I am the Sustainability Coordinator for the Office of for the University of Minnesota Duluth. Sorry, I'm a little distracted. You can hear the the monthly test of the emergency alert system out my window. So before we get started, I want to just cover a couple housekeeping topics. We're recording today's webinar for sharing on our YouTube channel for later, or for you to share with folks. So that will be emailed out on Friday. And we also encourage you to ask questions and share comments in the chat or the Q&A function that you see at the bottom of your screen. And then we will ask them at the end. So the format today is our guest, Kaya, will be presenting for 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll round out the last chunk of time with question and answers. Ryan, I will turn it back to you and mute myself so you can introduce Kaya.
Yep. Again, thank you so much for being here today, everyone. Our speaker for our Centering Justice and Equity and Sustainability program today is Kaya Schlagen, a junior at the University of Minnesota Duluth, majoring in psychology and minoring in Latin America studies. Kaya also works in the sustainability office at UMD. I'm going to hand it off to you, Kaya. Thank you so much for doing our program today.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. I'm glad to have everyone here today. Like Ryan introduced, my name is Kaya Schlagen. I use she, her pronouns, and I go to UMD, and I'm also a student assistant for the Office of Sustainability. I grew up in Two Harbors, Minnesota, so very close to here, which is on Anishinaabe land. And I'm very invested in pushing for more justice and equity in sustainability, as I have a personal responsibility to deconstruct our oppressive systems, because my privilege has played a major role in the creation of these systems and the continued support of them. I've spent the last semester researching and writing articles and creating social media posts for the UMD Office of Sustainability about the various social interactions with sustainability that include some of the movements I'll be talking about today, as well as privilege and sustainability as well. So today I'm going to be going through some of the history of sustainability and the movements that got us to where we are today, and how justice and equity, or the lack of, have influenced all of them. I'll also be talking about why we need to center justice and equity in sustainability and how you can help with that. So next slide, please. For me, the best place to start when talking about sustainability is privilege, which includes defining it, recognizing it, and using it to create a more just and equitable world for everyone. An easy way to think about privilege and understand it is by thinking of it as these invisible, unearned advantages that help you succeed in society. There are so many types of privileges, and a few are listed here, but it doesn't cover all of them. And chances are that at least a few affect you. For me, I've got many, starting with my race, also my physical ability, my education level. I grew up in a community that largely looks like me, and I grew up in a community where outdoor spaces were easily accessible, and I also felt safe in them as well. And I start here with sustainability because today it's a movement largely dominated by privilege. This discourse that we hear is mainly by white, straight, able-bodied, and male voices, when they're not necessarily the ones putting in a lot of the environmental work we see. Next slide. So even though these privileges and many others pervade in the sustainability movement today, its foundations looked very different. These values and practices that we attribute to sustainability today came from Indigenous peoples who have prioritized their balance with land and people for thousands and thousands of years. Additionally, people of color have led some of the most impactful environmental campaigns, and they continue to create positive changes in their communities. And already this brings us back to privilege, because many of these movements are formed out of necessity to protect their communities from hazards they disproportionately suffer from, and they don't necessarily have the choice of choosing to care about sustainability because it's a matter of health and safety for them and their neighbors. So we can say that sustainability is built on privilege, but also necessity, because at some point we'll all have to start caring about the planet and also our people if we want to survive incoming threats like climate change. Next slide. So one of the first movements associated with sustainability was the environmentalism movement. It started in the US in the late 1800s with writers like David Thoreau and organizers like John Muir, who recognized the importance of protecting the natural environment. And this focus on the planet seems like a great idea in theory, but unfortunately the movement's been dominated by racist and classist rhetorics throughout most of its history. White, affluent men led this movement in the beginning, and John Muir, who's credited with the founding of our national parks, ignored Indigenous peoples and their rights and pushed them out of their own land, fearing that they would be the ones to ruin the natural world, when we know that Indigenous peoples are some of the best stewards of the environment and have been throughout history. That doesn't mean that the environmentalism movement is completely bad, however. Next slide. There's a lot of successes and also issues, and it largely depends on who you are. So in 1872, the first national park, Yellowstone, was created, which was a great way to protect some of our land from developmental threats, but it also displaced the Crow Nation from their ancestral lands. In 1892, the Sierra Club was founded also by John Muir. And although this started as a club for wealthy white people to get outdoors and have these outdoor excursions, today it's actually become one of the most inclusive and dominating voices for environmental justice. So although they started really exclusively, today they've grown and have broadened their scope, which is a really important change to see. We also have the Clean Air Act, which was propelled by a lot of environmentalists. And we also have youth getting involved as well in the environmentalism movement today with activists like Greta Thunberg and her School Strikes for Climate. So we're also seeing this platform and voice for youth leaders across the world as well. So there's also been positives and negatives with this movement. Next slide. One major issue with environmentalism movement, however, that we can't ignore is that it didn't recognize how social issues are interconnected with environmental ones. Environmental racism was first coined by Dr. Benjamin Chavis, who's a civil rights leader, in 1982, to describe a systemic racism structure that harms communities of color who are forced to live near hazardous areas like landfills and processing plants, and as an effect, disproportionately suffer from related health issues, and asthma is one of those. Next slide. We see examples of environmental racism in practice throughout the world, even here in Duluth, but there's two cases specifically that I want to talk about right now. The first was in Houston, Texas in 1979, and it's the case of Bean versus Southwestern Waste Management Corporation. And this was really significant because it was the first lawsuit in the nation to use civil rights law to challenge environmental discrimination. Dr. Bullard, who is known as the father of environmental justice, which is another movement we'll get to in a little bit, led research for this case in Houston, Texas. And he found that over 80% of solidified trash in the city ended up in Black communities over a 48-year time period. And meanwhile, Black people made up only a quarter of the population in Houston. Flint, Michigan is one of the best known cases of environmental racism today. And I think it's a case a lot of us know more about, but for a brief recap, in 2014, officials wanted to save money, so they moved the water supply to the Flint River and failed to treat the water, which resulted in lead leaching into the homes of thousands of residents. and created extremely negative health consequences from lead poisoning that this community is still recovering from today. This was a predominantly Black community, and it took 18 months of resident complaints about their water for any officials to take any action or acknowledgement of this issue. There's also, today, we see environmental racism in Jackson, Mississippi right now with their own water crisis. And this community, again, is predominantly Black, and the white people of this community mostly live in wealthier suburbs and as an effect aren't dealing from this water crisis. Next slide. So the civil rights movement helped put a focus on environmental injustices across the country by framing it in a civil rights perspective, and this connection of social issues to environmental ones prompted the creation of a new environmental movement called the Environmental Justice Movement. Next slide. So this new movement shifted the environmentalism focus on just the planet to incorporate people and the planet, and it recognized how the environment differently affects different people in society based on our systems of oppression we have. Warren County is known by many as the birthplace of the environmental justice movement, with their 1982 sit-in, which was protesting the development of a hazardous waste site in their community. The environmental justice movement was officially recognized during the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in 1991. Over 1,000 activists attended the summit, and together they drafted 17 principles of environmental justice that continue to guide this movement today. And the summit focused on centering justice and equity, and also the self-empowerment of people of color to create change and sustainability and protect their communities from these hazards they disproportionately suffer from. Next slide. So one of the biggest challenges we face today in sustainability is the climate crisis. It's one of the biggest threats to our humanity and our way of life, and we're rapidly approaching the point where climate change impacts will be irreversible. And with this issue, we see a huge gap in justice and equity. The communities that are the most vulnerable to climate change impacts tend to have the fewest resources and power to prepare and recover from these devastations that include physical, mental, economic, and social harm. Some of these most vulnerable people include children, the elderly, Indigenous peoples, those with pre-existing health conditions, and especially if these people live in low-income communities where they're least likely to have the resources or connections to address these issues as opposed to wealthier communities. And this brings us right back around to privilege. Even in the climate crisis, privileged groups continue to prosper as marginalized groups are devastated by climate disasters. Next slide. There's so many different kinds of privilege that persist in the sustainability movement and in all of our facets of society. But a big one that I want to talk about right now is white privilege. Although there are a lot of other privileges that are impacting these movements, and white people can be disadvantaged in other ways, race is a factor that's been used since this country began to determine who has power and who doesn't. And it needs to be addressed when we're talking about sustainability so that we can move towards more equitable systems and solutions. But in order to do that, we need to challenge practices of white privilege and sustainability, like white saviorism, and in some cases, the profiting of white people from the climate crisis currently. Next slide. So these gaps in equity and justice have led to a rising movement in sustainability called the climate justice movement. And climate justice looks like providing these marginalized communities with a platform and listening to their complaints and what's happening to them in their communities. And not only listening, but acting when they describe these consequences they're experiencing. And if we don't center climate justice in this battle against the climate crisis, these marginalized communities and individuals around the world will continue to disproportionately suffer from a global consequence. Next slide. Okay, so right now we're going to do a group activity. Some of you may have heard of the privilege walk before, but if you haven't, it's a tool used to help you understand some of your privileges and how they help you succeed in society. It usually involves being in person, lining up and taking steps forward and backwards and comparing your privilege to other people in the room. But we're adapting it today for Zoom. So instead, you're just going to read the prompts and add up your points, and then you can just compare it with yourself. For a frame of reference, the range for most privileged people is about 12 to 16 in this exercise, and the range for the least is 0 to 4. Before you start, I just want to reiterate that this exercise doesn't cover every privilege available to us or every privilege that impacts us in society. And it's also not meant to make you feel bad about yourself or shamed. I think it's useful to understand some of your privileges and how they help you so that you can utilize them to make life more just for everyone. So I'll give everyone a few minutes to do this exercise, and then we'll all come back together.
So I put a link in the chat for the exercise, but I will also put it up here so folks can just read it off the screen if that's easier. Can you all see that? Cool. I think that's all the questions. As people are finishing up, do you want me to launch the poll, Kaya?
Yeah. So we have a Zoom poll for everyone to just record some of their reactions and thoughts, and it's completely anonymous.
Got about 77% of people have responded to the poll. Give it another 20 seconds or so as people finish up there. All right.
Yeah, so it looks like for most people, it was about what they expected, which is, it's a good sign that you know your privileges and how they're helping you in society. I think for me personally, I find that I constantly need to remember the many ways that I'm advantaged in society because it's not something that you usually think about every day. Like I mentioned before, it's these invisible, unearned advantages in society. So a privilege of having privilege is not having to think about it every day or be reminded of it. One thing that I just want to add about privilege is that it's not an individual issue like this exercise may make it seem. It's a complex societal system that's supported through our religious, our social, our political, and our economic systems. Privilege exists throughout all of our facets and movements, including sustainability. And learning more about these structures of privilege and power that are in our society and can help all of us be more conscious about how any sustainable solutions might impact different people and different groups differently. So addressing these privileges and working through them is a way that we can center marginalized voices and experiences in sustainability and create eco-solutions that are just and fair for everyone. None of us are exempt from these systemic influences, which means we should all have a shared interest in challenging and understanding them. Next slide. So we all have power to create change in our own lives and in our communities. There's just a few ideas listed here that you can implement in your own life to center justice and equity. So I'll go through them a bit. First of all, you can vote. It seems like a really simple action, but it does have a lot of power, especially when a lot of people do it. So vote for representatives who support policy for environmental justice and who commit to justice and equity in all of their work. You can also contact your representatives and tell them about issues that you care about and pressure them to support those adjoining policies. You also have a lot of power as a consumer, and you can choose where you give your money to a certain extent. I think there's a lot of college students in the call today, so I understand that it's not always something you can factor into your budget, but even making small changes is a lot more helpful than doing nothing. So maybe this summer you visit your local farmer's market and try to buy some produce there instead of going to a big chain grocery store. And the great part about that is that the money that you put into your community, you'll see more of it benefit your community as well. Instead of if you give it to a bigger corporation, most of that money is going to go away and outside of your community. So that's another simpler item that you can do in your own daily habits. You can also support diverse movements that are making these changes and advocating for change as well. You can follow them on social media, spread their message and content, talk about them with your family, your roommates, your friends, donate if you can to their causes, or even volunteer your time. There's a few organizations listed here to get you started if you're not sure where to go. Black Lives Matter is a really influential group doing some great work across communities in the US. Diversify Outdoors is a group that's trying to get the outdoors more accessible and welcoming for people who traditionally haven't been invited or feel excluded to the outdoors, including people of color, also disabled people, and people in the LGBTQ+ community. So that's another great group to look into as well. Intersectional Environmentalist is another group that's trying to branch off from the environmentalism movement and connect more of these social issues. It's a really young group of people that started it, and it's another great movement to look into, and they've got a lot of good resources on their website that you can jump off to from there. Also, you can listen and learn to those around you. If you're a student in the call today and you can fit it in your schedule, I highly recommend taking a class outside of your major and outside of any requirements. The classes that I have done that for have really helped shift my perspectives and how I view both my place in community and my communities as well. If you're not a student, or if you are, you can also attend lectures, attend events on campus and in the community, especially when they're devoted to topics you may not have a lot of knowledge or experience with. Also, a really easy thing to do is to create these conversations with your friends and family and other people in your life about justice and equity. And I found, at least when I start talking about these issues with my friends, I become more interested in them and finding out more like what we can do individually and what are the different perspectives as well. Another thing you can do is find out whose land you live on. We all live on Indigenous lands, and it's important to learn about the history of the land you live on and the people who were displaced from it. There's a link in our resource guide that we're adding, so you can look up whose land you live on. The link's also here, native-land.ca, and you just put in your zip code where you live, and it will show you the Indigenous First Nations whose land you live on. With our resource guide, there's also a bunch of ways that you can get involved, because I know this topic can seem very intimidating and you might not know where to go from here. So you can check out our resource link. There's things to do, things to read, things to watch, and things to listen to. So if you get information in one of those ways better than the others, there's resources for you to start your journey there. And finally, keep going. It's a journey with no end, which can seem daunting, but the more you learn, the more you realize you really don't know that much. But you'll start to notice more about the world around you and realize your place and your power in society to enact change. So we've got our resource list put in the chat for you all to look at. We've also got one last poll for this talk that we'd like all of you to take an action pledge and commit to doing something outside of this talk, after this talk, to help center justice and equity in your own life and your choices.
And I think maybe we'll hold that one until the very end in case some things come up in the Q&A session. Okay. What do you think, Kaya?
Yeah, I like that.
Cool. So we are to Q&A. So folks, if you want to put your questions for Kaya in the chat or the Q&A section down below in your Zoom window, that would be awesome. But I'm gonna kick off the questions with one for you, Kaya. You mentioned racism in Duluth, and I was just hoping that you would tell folks a little bit more, or give an example of racist policy that has impacted Duluth, if people are maybe unfamiliar or like, no, it doesn't happen here. Or
yeah, definitely. I think just for me personally, living in this area for most of my life, it's been easy to look at other cities across the US and other countries and think, wow, we're so much better than them, or we're so much more equal, when in reality, we're not at all. One instance of environmental racism that was used in Duluth, and we still see the effects of today, was redlining. And Duluth wasn't the only city that did this. Across the US, cities use this practice from the 1930s about to the 1960s to separate neighborhoods deemed risky, in quotations, from those deemed safe. And they blocked these risky neighborhoods from getting home loans. And this practice only depended on the people who lived in these neighborhoods and not the actual quality of the housing stock. The neighborhoods that were redlined in Duluth primarily consisted of Black people and immigrants. And over time, white neighborhoods who got this initial loan, they gained wealth while other neighborhoods suffered. And as well, the wealthier neighborhoods, because they got these home loans and they were deemed safer, businesses and schools moved there, and they had better resources and services than these other neighborhoods that were deemed risky and had these red lines. And we continue to see these impacts today in Duluth in our own neighborhoods, with wealth and income ownership inequality across the city. And we see these different neighborhoods that aren't as advantaged as others, and this is mainly due to this practice of redlining that's in our town's history.
Right. Looks like we have a Q&A there. Question is there an active plan to get more BIPOC to major in or study sustainably at UMD? I see the STEM field starting initiatives to fix the gap.
Yeah, that's a great question. I might push that over to Jonna because I'm not a STEM major, so I don't have any experience with that. But yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And from a curriculum standpoint, I'm not entirely sure if there is active plans. But definitely I would say that something that is kind of like the sustainability mantra is that sustainability can be in every major. If you are interested in sustainability, you can find ways to bring it in and make it a core part of your learning, whether you're a business major or a science major or a fine arts major. If you're interested in sustainability, you can weave it in through class projects and readings and extra things that you have the flexibility to bring those ideas in. But this is something that I think I would like to follow up on with some of my colleagues and find out more, because I really don't know the exact answer for this. So I appreciate whoever asked that.
So Kai, I have a question, and it's open to other people too. One of the things that I have thought a lot about is how you mentioned like creating conversation with friends and family, and you specifically mentioned talking about with your friends. But I find it sometimes more difficult for me to talk with my family about some issues related to racism. And I grew up in southern Minnesota. During the time where I grew up, there was a lot of immigration of East African populations, and so that often comes up in conversations that are just racist and really make me feel uncomfortable. And now that I have children too, I'm worried about them engaging, having these conversations around them. Any thoughts or ways to engage with family members about these topics when there might be really not welcoming to talking about them in a way that I feel comfortable with? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a great question. And right now I'm attending the CIRI Summit at UMD. And I just went to a talk this morning from Professor Ibram Kendi, and he kind of addressed this as well. So I'm just gonna kind of use what he said because I really liked his answer. His point basically was it's really hard sometimes to talk with your family about these discussions, especially with, I think, racism and anti-racism, because no one wants to admit that they're racist. That's not something we do in society where you would proudly say that. And so kind of going in a different perspective and just asking, maybe starting by asking your family members, what do you think racism looks like, or what do you think it is? So then you can move from there to talk about these discussions instead of waiting for them to say something and pointing out, oh, that's racist, because they're just, most people at least are going to deny that and say, that's not racist, I'm not racist. But if you go in from a different perspective and just, I think a lot of issues start by not understanding the definitions, and having your own personal definition can be really helpful. But if anyone else wants to contribute, I'd love to hear other thoughts as well about these conversations, because it is tricky and it's something that I have a privilege of not having encountered too much with my own family, but I think I'm definitely in the minority with that.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. Rather than attacking them as you as a whole are a racist person, maybe narrowing it down to like, that's a racist thing to say. Maybe that can open up some conversation too, and get you to that, like, what is your definition of racism there? How have you found this work in your time at UMD? Like, do you feel like this is something that was being talked about? Do you feel like it's something that's become more integrated over the last year with the murder of George Floyd and the kind of the social uprising around this in the most recent past? Obviously, it's not the first time that people have paid attention, but feels like it's got some momentum to change right now.
Yeah, definitely. I think I've been in my own classes and just my majors a bit disappointed at the lack of, especially acknowledgement with George Floyd, and this summer with the many protests and the momentum suddenly, it seems, for anti-racism and these movements that have really always been here. But I think it's one reason why I really push trying to take classes outside of your major and your field of study, because it's been in those classes that I've really been challenged to think about these intersections between our social issues and how they intersect with so many other facets in our lives, including sustainability, but not just limited to that. So I think it's changing, but it's not at the pace that I would like it to see change, and it's not, I don't think, equal in the fields of academics that are addressing it, at least in my classes. I don't know if any other students want to chime in with their experience this year, if you've noticed changes in your classes, but I can't say that I've noticed a big shift in addressing this, which it's really disappointing for me to see.
Ryan, I see another question in the Q&A. You want to field that one?
Muted, totally muted there. All right. So so this is talking about kind of recruiting and filling job open. It's kind of specific, but maybe we can explore this a little bit more in a broad sense too, but talking to the specifics. So the question is, when recruiting to fill job openings in the STEM or environmental fields, are there places where job postings can be advertised of a recruit BIPOC? And I don't know if we've identified that the acronym before, but I understand that as Black, Indigenous, people of color. And so I'm not sure if we know so much about this within our group here, but if you do, great. Otherwise, I was curious, maybe talking about our offices, even how we connect and are trying to diversify our offices in ways, efforts that we've either heard about from our colleagues or other areas. But if you know better about like specific job posting networks to connect with, that would be great too.
Yeah, I can't speak too much about the job networks, but I can talk a little bit about what our campus is doing, and then maybe if John and Ryan have some ideas in terms of networking and jobs, they can talk about that in a little bit. But first of all, at the UMD Office of Sustainability, we've really made a big push this year to make more of these connections with social injustices and inequities and link them more clearly to sustainability for people, because they're linked and they're so intertwined. But with sustainability, sometimes we tend to greenwash things and focus on just the composting or the renewable energy, which are really important components of sustainability. But it kind of brings back to the environmentalism viewpoint, where if we just focus on the planet, we're neglecting the people, and then we see all these inequities and injustices and issues like environmental racism that pervade because we're not talking about them and we're not bringing attention to them. So our office this year, we started creating a lot more content on social media, has been our main platform just because of COVID-19. But hopefully when we get back in person, we can do more engagement with students in person, face to face. But we've been talking about defining a lot of these social and environmental movements. This past month, we've been talking a lot about Black History Month and Black environmentalists who've contributed to the field, as well as how Black environmentalism has made a huge impact in the history of sustainability. This month, we're focusing on, for Women's History Month, we're going to talk about some women environmentalists on our social media page, as well as how sexism and racism, especially for women of color, is impacted and how we see that in sustainability. This past semester, we've put out just a lot of articles, resources, and we've done some webinars like this to address some of the social issues. I know there's one on our YouTube page about green periods as well, and making that accessible. So making these intersections has been really important for our office this year, and it's something that we're definitely continuing as we keep learning more, to keep sharing and making it a bigger part of our message. So that's a big spiel about our office, but yeah, if John and Ryan want to get back to the question about job boards, they can do that too.
Yeah, and something that I'm realizing, I think because we are spending so much time online in this COVID period, I feel like we were maybe advertising to the the choir, you know, our email list and people who already follow us on social media would see our job openings. And so I think that's an area that we struggle with, is how to reach a wider network of students. Ryan, I don't know how CSS is about emailing students directly, but they don't give us access to like an all student listserv because they don't want faculty and staff harassing students with email after email of cool things that are happening. And so I think it is a challenge that we need to do better on, of where we're advertising to recruit students and recruit with jobs. And if anybody has places that would make sense for us to recruit from, we would love to expand our knowledge base in that regard and just get opportunities in front of more eyes, especially BIPOC eyes, and get those voices into more roles within the university.
I do have access to an all-campus email, like a student email. But I think, you know, that's an easy fix. That's an easy sort of like, oh, we did this or we made it. I think it's I think about welcome versus expected. And do I welcome people from all, you know, different backgrounds, or do I expect and prepare for people from different backgrounds and different experiences? And I think those are two different things. An example would be, I worked at Mankato State University a few years ago, and we were putting in like a washing station for people who are Muslim and practicing, and kind of just a challenge, like, okay, you're all welcome, but do we like provide, are we aware and do we provide of resources to help people live, feel comfortable in how they're living and accessing a space? I think a lot of what I just push myself is not looking for that quick fix. Not, you know, I want that sort of like, oh, okay, what board can I put it on? I think, you know, the NAACP, I think, is a recent one, you know, job boards that are recruiting specifically for people connected with that organization is one that we've kind of switched over to for some postings and stuff to include that. But I think a lot of it is about developing relationships and trying to find, you know, showing up and engaging in communities that are not our own. And we look at, you know, a lot of, at least what I see in our community still at St. Scholastica, or our partnerships too, still represent a pretty, you know, college age, often presenting as white, able-bodied, educated people. And so it's a challenge that I think to take to myself and others of getting out of that. It's just a lot harder in this virtual world to do that, or I don't know how to do that well. And yeah, but I think more is required of us or asked of us to do that. Another thing I'd add in terms of recruiting for students and also then recruiting for employees, being really clear about what your commitment to equity, inclusion, and diversity is in your postings and how you screen for the job. And then also when you're bringing them in, people in, supporting that and encouraging that to be continued throughout the position itself and how you are introducing people to the community. There's a couple other questions here. One, well, there's comments and then there's some questions. There's a comment in the Q&A. Just, I think responding, Kaya, to kind of your thoughts about what people see with at both UMD and St. Scholastica. Not so much a question, but I'll just read it here. I agree with you. Overall, there's been little change in my classes. My writing professor was the only professor that addressed George Floyd and challenged us to write about it. That's from Madeline. At CSS, there's a comment from Brooklyn on the chat. You can all see it. And I think the line that states at the very end, oftentimes it feels like we're aware of the issue, but don't know how to make a difference or make a change. I gotta scroll down here. Yeah, make a significant difference. And I think it's often a place where I can sit in my place of privilege. Okay, I understand this. What do I do? And I think you gave us some good ideas to kind of move forward and stuff. What were some first things that you felt like you were doing, Kaya? Like, okay, I understand this. Now I want to do something. Were there some initial things that kind of took you a little bit of a leap of faith for yourself to do more stuff? Or how would you describe your journey into being more engaged and doing stuff?
Yeah, I think for me, this year has been a big year of learning and change and a lot of unlearning as well. Yeah, kind of like I mentioned before, I feel like the more I learn about these intersections and these issues, the more I realize how much I don't know about them, which can make it pretty overwhelming at times, but also there's a lot of other jumping off points. So, I mean, these issues, they're really complex and there's so many different angles you can take them at. So what I've really done this year is just to try to find one source that's addressing one issue I'm thinking about. Maybe that's race and sustainability, maybe that's land inequity or wealth ownership in the US and that history. Reading that article, seeing what videos and links that they've attached. Usually they provide a lot of jumping off points as well. And then you dig deeper and deeper into that research. And I think the great thing about a lot of the resources is that they do provide actionable items. And it's been a little hard this year trying to get involved in a community per se, but there's a lot of things you can do just from home even, whether that's supporting these movements. I think it's easy to not take into account how powerful word of mouth is, even over social media. So if you see a post that's educating on something maybe you don't know that much about, maybe it's impacting your community, just sharing that or liking it or sending it to someone in one of your social groups, and then you can start those conversations. Yeah, it's an interesting year to try to get really engaged in the community, but there are ways to do it. There are people still putting in a lot of work, and there's still ways to support them as well.
And just to add on to that, something that it's kind of hard with COVID because we're not seeing a ton of people, but getting comfortable with the discomfort of calling out racism when you see it, especially within your own peer group. You know, if a friend says something that really doesn't sit well with you, like being able to say, hey, I don't really think that's a cool thing to say, and trying to have a conversation about it and addressing those things and, you know, making clear those definitions of what's okay and what's not okay. It's not like you need to be policing other people's, to use a bad term, but policing other people's thoughts or anything. But, you know, when you see it and you say it, there's a chance for dialogue, and there's a chance for mutual learning and for improving the way that people interact in the world and the way that we treat each other and we talk about each other. And there's just a lot of power in that interpersonal connection. So it's probably, I think, especially when you're talking with your family, that's one of the hardest things to do, because, you know, they're more comfortable saying, maybe fighting back a little bit. But I find it in a friend group, like, if it really makes you uncomfortable and they really are your friends, like being able to talk about that and share your discomfort is really important. There is kind of a long question in the Q&A about technology and nuclear, and I'm going to try and unpack it a little bit. And Kaya, I don't know if you want to weigh in just on the very last portion about like why technology isn't a perfect fix for combating climate change, and then maybe we can dig in a little bit more into what they're going. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Let's see. Yeah, I'm reading the question right now. Yeah, it's a great question. Let's see, rearrange my thoughts. I think, yeah, I think with technology, for me at least, it seems like it's a lot of talk and no action. So while it's great to talk about these issues and make these connections and voice your frustration, if that's all you do, then it kind of just ends there. So I think action can look like talking to your representatives, making these changes, changing the companies you're supporting, and looking up who their investors are, who they're investing in, and kind of putting that action with your talk, they're both important pieces, but you can't just leave it as I'll post this thing in solidarity of one issue, or I'll post this one thing and that's my work for today. It's done. It's a constant process of having to say, okay, here's the issue. Let's learn about it. Let's understand it. And then let's find out a way to challenge it or to change it for the better. I'm not sure if that answers the question enough, but that's at least my take on just why we can't just rely on technology to fix climate change.
Yeah, something that it makes me think about is technology is often deployed inequitably as well. You know, folks that can, you know, not talking about a nuclear power plant because that was the first part of the question, but when you think about individuals who have enough money to put solar panels on their own homes, that's a technology action to address climate change that not everybody will have access to. So there are multiple, there's no silver bullet for fighting climate change is what I would say in response to that. There's no single thing that we can do that will be the best thing or the most effective thing. And in technology, it kind of gets back to the idea that we're leaving out the people aspect. Like if we only focus on the technology, well, we just have enough brain power behind this thing, we'll be okay. And it still leaves out that human component of when you say we'll be okay, which we are you talking about? Are you talking about a very select few folks in your kind of your realm? Or are you talking about all people across the world? So it gets into those more complex situations. It's a it's not a weird question. The little parentheses at the end, it's a very complicated question. There's lots of layers to that. Probably more than we can even address here today.
So I want to be mindful of time. There was another question about water and water science, but at this point, I'm a little bit nervous about getting into it without giving some time for Kaya to kind of wrap things up. Although, John and Kaya, do you think we want to try to engage with that last question? Do we have a moment to do that here? Question is, I'll bring it up here. So from a water science perspective, what portions of environmental justice should be addressed? What are some issues related to environmental justice? I know we already talked about Flint. Are there other things that, in addition to Flint, or things that come to mind when we're talking about water and water science?
Yeah, I think water, I mean, we all need it to live, which makes it a really valuable resource. But unfortunately, I think in the US, because it's such a common thing, it's not something we necessarily think a lot about until we hear these communities who don't have access to clean water. And it seems like such a simple life resource and a right that everyone deserves, that it seems pretty crazy to hear especially here when we live next to one of the largest freshwater lakes in the world. Water seems like it's something that's always going to be there, but there's always issues. And I think we see a lot of environmental racism specifically focused on water, and when communities suddenly don't have access to clean water as well. I kind of mentioned it briefly, but there's right now, even in Jackson, Mississippi, they have this massive water shortage from these water breaks in their city. I mean, most of it's because of old infrastructure, and the city doesn't necessarily have the resources to suddenly change their infrastructure overnight and update it. And I think a big reason why is because this community is made of predominantly Black community, and wealthy white people have moved out to the suburbs where they do have access to clean water. And this community, they don't necessarily have the power and the resources to enact change. So this is just one example, but we're seeing water issues as an increasing, it's a social and an environmental issue. That's something that we definitely need to take more time to unpack, I think, as well. But Jonna might have some other stuff to add to that.
Yeah, just a quick thought before we wrap up on that. What portions of environmental justice regarding water science should be addressed? All of them. But obviously as maybe one person, you can't address all of them. So finding something that you feel like is an actionable cause in your own life, within your community, something that you're attached to or that you can see the benefit for others. Maybe it doesn't affect you personally, but if it affects other people in your community, to rally behind folks that are being impacted by such a thing occurring, whether it's lead in the water or lack of access issues or different things like that. But just finding the things that are close to home that you can be active on and have a voice on, I think is really important. Again, like it takes all the little parts working together and people working on different pieces to bring about a more equitable society, which will benefit everybody in the long run. Okay, we'll turn it back to you. Any final thoughts that you want to share with folks? Oh, we got our pledge poll.
We do have a pledge poll. Yeah, should we do that right now quick?
Yep, I will get that launched. So here's your first action step. And you can pick multiple things to pledge to do. Might take you a little minute to read through them. We tried to make it a decent list, but obviously there are plenty of other things that folks can pledge to. So you're allowed to select something else and share what you might do in the chat that might inspire others to also act. It looks like people are definitely selecting more than one, which is exciting. Awesome. So there's a lot of folks saying they're going to talk with friends and family and social networks about justice and equity issues. Registering to vote, that's ranking pretty high, and showing up to the polls for local and national elections, very important to exercise your right. What else is getting some high marks? Reading, watching, or listening to 3 items from the resource guide shared today. There's some good pieces in there. Learning more about privilege. Excellent. We've got about 75% of folks have voted. Yeah, this is amazing. There's some really awesome pledges here. And something that's important, not just once you make a pledge, is to also tell somebody about a pledge you made. It helps keep you accountable, even if it's just, planting a seed that you'll follow up a little bit further. So sharing that information out with folks after you've made those pledges. All right. Now, final thoughts, Kaya.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for coming here today. You've been a really great audience and super engaged, which has been fun. These issues are really complex and they can seem really daunting and end of the world and oh my gosh, all this bad stuff is happening. But I just want to end that with every issue that we're facing today, there's always groups of people in the background doing work to challenge and change them for the better. And often these movements start from individual ideas and observations. So I hope you all take some time today or in the coming days to look over the resource list we've provided and start committing to some new actions and goals in your own life to focus and center justice and equity in all aspects of your life as well.
Awesome.
All right, thank you so much, Kaya, for sharing your knowledge with us today. Really appreciate the time you gave and all the people who joined us today for the talk. If you have any additional questions or would like to connect directly with the CSS or UMD Sustainability offices, please reach out to the emails listed on your screen or on our social media channels. And also consider attending our next Art of Resilience program, Food Security and Food Sovereignty, on Wednesday, March 17th at 3 p.m. Our presenters, Connor, Henneberry, and Caitlin Walsh are working with the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior Chippewa, and they'll share their knowledge they've gained for their work in those areas.
Great. Thanks, Kaya. Thanks so much. And thanks everybody for attending. It's been a great conversation. Bye.
Thank you all.